guess sort of moving on to a bit of a new topic here, and something I wanted to sort of talk to you about was essentially like the future of rowing, and where you see it going in the future in terms of sort of media wise and events wise, and something that I've sort of been trying to like talk about on this podcast basically is what different people from all different backgrounds and sort of different positions within the sport like want a direction to be essentially. And I guess something very specific to you would be what are your thoughts on sort of Cox recordings from races? Do you think that could be the next step in sort of the rowing media side of things?
Um, okay, well, the first part of that question, like the direction of the sport, like I think there needs to be, I think definitely a sort of national level,
Mm-hmm.
there can be a bit more intuition with how running races are sort of offered to the rowing community. I
Mm-hmm.
think maybe I'm in a privileged position where I'm sort of sat here saying that the classic, you know, doing like a local head race and Falls Head before Christmas, and then gearing up towards the Eights Head, and then doing Met Regatta and Marlow Regatta, and then doing a Henley, you
Mm-hmm.
know, for 10, 15 years. I think it's sort of like, you know, is there anything else?
Mm-hmm.
Uh, when I was a bit younger at Brooks, we did a race called the Outrow, which was run by Red Bull.
Mm-hmm.
um, and that was run on the Seven Ball,
Okay.
which is a wave that goes up the
And
river.
yeah.
And it's essentially it's an elimination race,
Mm-hmm.
and it was it's totally different from any other race
Mm-hmm.
that, that I've ever done. Not just because there's a wave catching you up, which is obviously
Yeah.
quite epic, but it's like you can't just pace a 5K because you've got a
Mm-hmm.
wave catching you up. You've got to
Yeah.
get ahead of everyone and make sure that you're not eliminated, but at
Mm-hmm.
the same time, you're obviously trying to outlast everyone else as well.
Yeah.
Like that's just one example of something that can be done at a national level. Like, why do we have to have just 5K head races and then 2K
Mm-hmm.
regatas
Yeah.
every single year?
Yeah. And another thing I was talking with Ronnie about is still all these things are very fresh in my in my memory.
Yeah.
He was saying across Europe they sort of have these sort of sprint leagues where
Mm.
it's much shorter distances on sort of cities in Europe that
Yeah.
are A sort of accessible to the public so they can go and watch, and then B shorter so you can actually see the full race. And something that keeps coming up when I'm sort of doing research for like articles and stuff that I'm writing is that things like Head of the River, if you're on Hammersmith Bridge, you see 2 minutes of racing max, and then it takes you 3 hours to find out the results at the end of the
Yeah.
day. I think it's important that first, especially from a spectator's point of view, you like know who's winning, you can see the race, and then you know who's won at the end. And it's
Yeah.
it's like I think that's just quite a basic thing that rowing often gets wrong. And even if
Yeah.
it's just things like we're at a point now where you can get live splits fairly easily and stuff like if someone does in Ironman, everybody has like a tracker and people can track the person they're supporting online sort of through their website. The technology's there, and I just feel like it's rowing is missing that.
I I would I would even go a step further and say the technology is there, but have we tried to go is like have we tried to go too far with it? Like I think
Mm-hmm.
the out of the necessity for 2K racing and you know coming like getting everyone in the country to sort of have like come to Dorney Lake or to come to Nottingham to do these like big regattas, I
Mm-hmm.
feel like local regattas have been massively looked over.
Yeah.
Like I came from uh Chester, and
Mm-hmm.
Chester regatta used to be massive. This is, you know,
Mm-hmm.
going back sort of decades. And like I think that, you know, for the future of the sport and keeping people involved, I think especially with potential changes to rowing happening in the IOC and like
Mm-hmm.
the being at the Olympics, like I think there needs to be much more engagement with the wider public
Mm-hmm.
in something that is more exciting. And I don't know if you remember the Power 8 sprints.
Yeah, that was something that
Yeah,
came up as well. Yeah.
that was so epic to watch. And you looked at
Mm-hmm.
the harbour there where they were running the event, and it was absolutely rammed.
Mm-hmm.
And like, okay, I'm sure I don't know the ins and outs of why that wasn't carried on, but for the life of me, I can't understand why something of that sort can't be like fired up again.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's,
And
think
so
of how many sort of short stretches of water, like just harbors or like rivers where it runs through a city of some sort.
mm-hmm.
It would be so easy to set up and so easy to advertise.
Mm-hmm. And
I think that'd be awesome.
so I did do a bit of research on this because it was something when I sort of first started thinking about this and like, why don't people watch rowing? It was, well, make an event of it. That, oh, there's already been an event of it and it didn't work. Why? And it was basically no one wanted to sponsor it. And I think that's not necessarily because it wasn't something that was interesting to watch. I think it's they probably just didn't have the expertise to look in and say, okay, how do we get sponsors? Because there are so many events and things like that where even like small town events where like my local bonfire is sponsored. It's sort of it's like it's probably not that difficult to sort of find sponsors and like whether you're going for volume. But I think the issue was they just were looking for like one big sponsor to follow the race in the same way that maybe the boat races where they've either got sort of Gemini or whatever it is coming up on the front of their all-in-ones. I think that's what they were looking for. And I don't think that's what they necessarily need to be looking for. I think they need to find something where they can support the event and hold it up and sort of stop necessarily worrying about, okay, we need to make loads of profit. I think it just needs to sort of be done.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Well, I think like if you ask any rower that's raced the Henley Royal Regatta what they loved about the racing, people love doing something for a crowd. And like, okay, 2,000 meters is pretty hard to pad out a crowd, but I'd say only really Henley Royal Regatta manages to do that. Not even like World Championships manage to do that. So like, I think.
But I'll tell you what else does. Sorry, like Oxford College bumps racing, and I'm sure it's the same in Cambridge. You get like, I think I've read somewhere you get like 100,000 people going to watch on the weekend.
Yeah, that's very true. Actually, watching
seems insane. And it's like there's no sponsors there. That's completely run either by volunteers or people that are on a committee that sort of do it sort of part-time. And it's a huge event and it's just fun to watch and be a part of. And it's just such a shame that like people don't take that and put it into other aspects of the sport.
Well, I guess that was something that I hadn't actually thought about that. That's like another sort of format of rowing where like unless you're in like Oxford or Cambridge, even if you're at like City of Oxford Rowing Club or like Cantabs or something, like outside of those spaces, I don't really feel like there's any other places that do that kind of thing. Do they do it at I think they might do it at Durham. I'm not sure.
I'm sure there's a few sort of dotted around that give it a go, but
it's I think it's I think there's definitely somewhere there's a niche there somewhere where I think in the UK someone could set up like an X-Row kind of thing, or like a sprint league like they have in Germany, or like the Heineken Cup, that kind of thing where there's like a 5K and then a 500-meter sprint. There's definitely room for something there, and I think that the battle is that I'm sure people would love to do it, but at the same time, those same people are also wanting to win Henley as well.
Exactly.
There's a program and a schedule that sort of feeds into that. So it's tricky.
This is
I don't think we can solve it on this podcast.
Yeah. But this is something that I've sort of discussed before. And if you actually look at the rowing calendar, there are huge gaps. If you look between sort of March and May, there's a few gaps. You've sort of got Bucks Regatta
Mm.
for students, and then like Wallingford Regatta sort of in the middle there as well. And then before head of the river, you've sort of got a few down on the tideway, and I'm sure there's plenty of local races, but there's no sort of big events in that space. Equally, right after September, you've got nothing really outside of trials, which 90% of rowers, whether if you sort of look at the whole demographic of rowers from amateur up to sort of elite level, there's just no competition for people to do. And I think within sports like football, like you were talking about earlier, it's like you have a match every single weekend. While I'm not saying we need to have rowing every single weekend, I think it's definitely a direction that we could be heading into, just to sort of make it more interactive and engaging for like your family. Like I know for a fact, so I've said this to my parents before, things like Head of the River, like don't worry about coming down to watch because you'll get cold, you'll see me go by, and then you sort of just be stood there for a couple hours while I then go de-rig the boat and then go home. And it's like it's not that engaging for anyone that's not just in the boat. And equally, even if you're in the boat, you're sat on the start line for sometimes a couple hours if you're sort of one of the last ranked boats. And it's just, I feel that there must be a better way of doing it.
Maybe there is. It might take a bit longer to figure that out, but yeah, I'm sure that there's. I think rowing is especially with the 2028 Olympics is going to be 1500 meters, and beyond that, things might change even more. Like I mean, when I was a bit younger, GB the GB rowing team used to do this thing called the Australian Youth Olympic Festival, where you would send a much smaller team of sweepers and scullers and a cox, and out of that small group of I can't remember how many it was, you'd have like a dozen rowers. They would double up and they'd do the quad and the double, and the sweep rowers would do like the pair, and like everyone would combine and do an 8. And it became more about like the sort of the team performance rather than the individual boat class performance. I wonder whether like the Olympics might go towards that way, because they want to see heroes again. They want a Steve Redgrave, or Chris Hoy, or a Mo Farah. That's the kind of thing they want out of the sport. They don't want to have Mo Farah winning the 5K and then someone completely different winning the 10K, and then someone different, like Mo Farah winning all of those races. He's heralded as like this hero, and he brings the crowds to come and watch the Olympics.
And I think another thing about rowing is it just seems so impersonal, because it's almost you're just seeing a vehicle when you see a boat go by, and there's no like personality within that. And I think that's again something that can be sort of looked at and sort of taken apart and sort of looked at in that way, in terms of I think there needs to be sort of a emotion and story put behind it. And that sort of goes back to my previous question about sort of Cox recordings and what you think about that.
Yeah, I think with Cox recordings, I think it's a tricky one, because you might get the odd expletive here and there. But I definitely think that, like, I think the boat race is obviously they mic up the coxes and they have a little camera in the bottom of the boat so that you get almost like a view of the cox's face and their sort of their sort of demeanor in the boat of like how they're sort of reacting to a situation, which I think is a really cool insight. But I feel as though teams can get quite secretive.
Yeah.
Like,
do you think that's a good thing?
I think if it like I know that I wouldn't want to, like, obviously I've put up a coxing recording from years and years ago now, that 2017 recording, which as a sort of, I sort of say this quite openly these days, like I don't actually think it's a very good recording, but
Hmm.
it's, we happened to win Henley with it and
Yeah.
like it did a job. I cox very differently from that nowadays. And I think one day I probably will upload my recordings. Like I record every race at the moment.
Okay.
Um, and I've always sort of got, one eye on the next year. And I don't really want to be, I think with coxing, you release very much like a plan of your race. And
Hmm.
even though when it all boils down to it, you can do nothing to affect other crews. I
Hmm.
think it does give a small insight into what you're doing if you release a
Yeah.
coxing recording. Because if you're if you're
Well, there is
missing,
that huge psychological side of rowing as well, isn't there?
yeah,
So
yeah.
if your plan is to go out ahead and hope the other team sort of thinks you're just faster and give up, then that plan's kind of out
Yeah,
the window
exactly.
if they know that's coming.
If your main rival sort of gets a length up and then you reel them back in, and in the back of your mind, the doubts are creeping in, like, oh god, they're so much quicker than us, and they just seem to be
Hmm.
like holding us off every time. If they released a recording and you knew that they got to the 12:50 mark and they
Hmm.
were clinging on for dear life, that
Yeah.
might give you a bit of confidence. You might be like, right, well, actually, they are only human. Like
Hmm.
maybe there's something we can do that can actually like turn that over.
Yeah.
I think there's pros and cons to like being slightly secret with these plans. And
Hmm.
I know that I wouldn't release. I think after I released that recording in 2017, and I
Hmm.
was like, right, well, actually, I want to try and get a foot in the national team. I kind of said that I wasn't going to release anything else until I'd stopped coxing.
Hmm.
Mainly for that reason.
So if they approached you at an event coming up, say the Olympics, fingers crossed, um, and they said, okay, this year we want to put a recording on all the coxes so we can sort of get some good shots, would you, do you think, decline or?
I think for the Olympics, I think I'd do it. Yeah. Um, because I think generally things will start again
Mhm.
in, a new Olympiad. Um, and I don't, even going into an Olympic cycle, I feel like previous form is totally irrelevant because
Mhm.
if there's one race where it matters, it's going to be your Olympic final.
Of
And,
course.
I don't think anyone is going to be secret or hiding anything like that.
Mhm.
It's your life's work going into that competition.
Yeah.
Um, I have actually I Eamon Glavin, who does some, the like that amazing like rowing footage. He's sort
Yeah.
of like, doing loads of really good stuff over in America. He actually did ask if I could be mic'd for a Henley. Uh,
Because he did the footage of the US boat that you were racing, was
there
it?
was that year where he also asked Henry Fieldman if he'd be mic'd up.
Hmm.
And it's weird because like I was coming through a Brooks system where Henry Belash Webb is like Henley is the absolute pinnacle.
Hmm.
Like you get into the GB team and like Henley is almost like a bit of a stepping stone because you've got Lucerne World Cup 3 literally the
Hmm.
weekend after.
Yeah.
So, if asking to be mic'd up at Henley is sort of like, well, no, because I'm going to be doing this race plan
Hmm.
probably in about 5 days' time. So
Hmm.
I don't really want that going out to the
Yeah.
world. Um, so yeah, I think I'd do it for an Olympics if I
Yeah.
was selected. But yeah.
And do you think there's any other perspectives that we're sort of missing out on, from either within the boat or outside of the boat that you think would be sort of an interesting new point of view?
Um, yeah, that's an interesting question. I do feel like the sort of drone footage has given a bit more insight to like what goes on within the boat.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting because it kind of, I kind of feel as though there's already sort of quite a lot of necessary information. You've got speed, you've got rating, you've got time. I
Mm-hmm.
feel as though if you were to sort of get any more like insight into the boat, you might start losing
Mm-hmm.
the average viewer. I
Mm.
mean, like already, I get family members sort of talking to me after a race and being like, well, I thought they were going to beat you because they were rating so much higher than you and they
Yeah.
must have been trying lots harder. Like, what happened?
Mm.
And, like rating doesn't necessarily work like that.
Yeah.
So even there, you're sort of losing people.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't know. That is a tricky one. I do wonder whether there's some way of like getting cameras on a boat, because I mean cameras must be like you must be able to get
Well, there's
like
that viral
really good
video of
cameras.
Dave Buick-Copley before you did the Grand a few years ago
Mm,
from the bow seat. I believe it was Dave, wasn't it?
yeah,
And you're doing a start, and that went very viral if I remember right. And that was
yeah.
because it just gave such a great like viewpoint. And obviously, it's you can't really strap a GoPro to someone's chest for a race because of all sorts of reasons. It sort of might
But I think
restrict your
that's
chest or
where like
something.
the sort of big stern camera in the boat race becomes quite
Mm-hmm.
interesting. And they did used to do that for the World Championships, I think back
Mm-hmm.
in like 70s or the 80s. But there's a line in there between, on the one hand, you've got what would bring in viewership and what would make the event exciting. But
Mm-hmm.
then on the other hand of that, you've got people have sort of put their lives into this level of performance. And
Mm-hmm.
is there, does that all of the, if you're starting to rig tons of tech into a boat and it makes it heavier or something,
Mm-hmm.
obviously everyone would have to have the same thing, but I'm just wondering whether there'd be, you know,
Well, it's going to be harder to get records, I guess.
yeah. But I guess that's, yeah, there's it's complicated, isn't it?
It is. It is. And I've had a fair bit of time off between Henley and now, and I've sort of been putting, I guess, quite a lot of thought and time into thinking, like having finished Henley and this year, sort of coming off and thinking, well, how could I sort of try and get more people into the sport? And that's sort of something that I'd like to try and do. And a lot of people that I've spoken to, it's rowing can honestly just sort of be quite a boring thing to watch, and
Mm,
even sometimes quite a boring thing to do. Like there's only so much enjoyment you can get out of doing an 18K erg, and I think it's just finding ways to make it more engaging and getting new people into the sport, as well as getting new people watching the sport. And I think there's a certain angle that we're potentially missing. And I think if you look back, and sort of obviously they're releasing the Boys in the Boat movie this Christmas, or I think in the UK sort of just starts at Christmas. And if you sort of read that, you hear about the sort of journalists going in and like really yapping at the heels of all the coaches and sort of saying what's going on, like, and the riverbanks would be absolutely lined with hundreds of thousands of people. There'd be like a train following the race down and all this sort of stuff. And it just seems like there must be a way of sort of bringing that back. And I was talking to Ronnie again, and he was saying sort of at the head of the Charles, when that event is on there, the whole town and the whole area is completely involved with the whole event, just because there's like hundreds of thousands of people that come down to
mm,
go and compete and watch, and it just becomes so entrenched in that town that
yeah.
And it's
Yeah,
just
well, I did do Head of the Charles in
mhm,
2019, and I can definitely attest to that. It's epic to do, and it is exactly as you just said. It's so busy, and there's so many people who come out to watch. Not just rowing fanatics, but it does bring out tens of thousands of people just to see, just to be part of the event and just to see what's going on.
mhm,
Um, I mean, I would say that Henley Regatta does that as well. Uh,
mhm. And then you sort of got the boat race as well, in
yeah,
that sense, where you'll get lots of people coming down to watch this thing go by.
yeah,
Um, and I think you could sort of look at it in a way similarly. I don't know if you've ever gone and watched the Tour de France, but
mm,
when you go and watch that, I know when I've gone to see it, I was a lot younger and I definitely didn't know who was riding in it or what was going on even. But it was just a case of sort of being there in that atmosphere and watching them absolutely zip by in the blink of an eye and then suddenly they're gone. But it was just sort of about being there. And I remember before the race, they'd send out like a big parade of sort of vehicles would go past. They'd be like lobbing water bottles out the window at the crowds and stuff like that. And I think just sort of making it an event for the crowd is such an important part of racing as well. And in terms of the 6 lane racing over a 2 kilometer course, it's really difficult to get that, I think.
mm. I think, yeah. I mean, obviously, I'm sure there's plenty of sort of initiatives to be like sort of driving accessibility to the sport.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think it's necessarily just going to happen from accessibility. I think it's also visibility as well. Um, and I sort of look over to somewhere like Germany,
Mm-hmm.
where I did a race called the Nets Cup, which is an international race. It's about 12 kilometers,
Mm-hmm.
um, and you race against the German national eight, and that's a similar sort of thing. It's it usually happens in around September. It's pretty cold. It's in this place called Rendsburg, and
Mm-hmm.
it's basically just a massive shipping canal that goes on for miles and miles and miles, and yet everyone comes out to watch it. The
Mm-hmm.
German national eight have won their equivalent of the sort of sport BBC Sports Personality of the Year kind of thing. Like they'll win Team
Mm-hmm.
of the Year or something. Like they are heralded in Germany and they're created as these heroes. Whereas
Mm-hmm.
I feel like a lot of the mainstream media in this country just don't want to know about rowing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and I mean that the reasons for that go way back, and that's a whole different discussion. But I feel as though things like what you're doing, there's sort of magazines and papers that have been sort of created over the last few years to sort of really push the idea of rowing and how awesome it can be.
Mm-hmm.
Photography companies, videographers, like all of these sort of little businesses and ideas that have been set up and that are gaining tons of traction,
Mm-hmm.
especially with like the power of social media. I feel like those are sort of some of the ways in which visibility can meet accessibility.
Mm-hmm. And that was something I did research for in my dissertation. I was helping out Feathering Square. I don't know if you've heard them with Lenny and Miles over there
Yeah.
doing that. And I was sort of helping them reach more people essentially, and that was my project. And in that, I found a really interesting study about the lacrosse league in the US, the Premier Lacrosse League. That's difficult
Mm.
to say. And it was basically these two ex lacrosse players said, "This is terrible. No one's watching. No one cares, and people sort of think we're just like upstuck arrogant people that just play a sport that no one cares about. And they went in and they set up a brand new league outside of the existing major lacrosse league that's sort of aligned with the NBA and NHL and all the other sort of national sporting bodies in the US. And they made their key focus engagement with people. So instead of sort of having each team having its social media page and sort of the body having a social media page, their sort of main thing was they'd send people to the athletes. So they'd have a post. Their like main body would just be reposting stuff from the teams and from the players and sort of directing. And that meant that their engagement levels are insanely high. So typically with bigger pages with like sort of hundreds of thousands of followers, you'd be lucky to have 10% engagement, and they've got sort of 50, 60, 70% engagement just because all they're doing is sending people to the actual players and saying, look, this is a real person. You can have a conversation with this person and they will tell you about the sport. And a huge part of it as well was just making the sport seem more accessible. So saying, hey, like, come and watch. Like this is where you can come and see. This is what you can do.
And like I'm one of those people that kind of thing calls out for, because how many kids do you think go through a point when they're like, going through school, or even like, kids come out of school, they go to university, they want to try something new. I mean, when I was sort of struggling with football and I was like, right, I've got to try something new, I was exceptionally privileged in the sense that there was a rowing club who was like, right, everyone come and have a go. Let's just give it a go. And not everyone has access to that, but a lot of people in this country do have access to social media and do look at stuff on Instagram. They do look at stuff on TikTok. And like, those are the kinds of things that going to attract a lot of people these days. Like, social media is so powerful. And I completely agree. Like that, what you're just talking about, like if there's a focus on engagement and putting stuff out there that is, it doesn't always have to be like professionally done, but I think just meaningfully done, and with a clear message, and it shows the best aspects of our sport. And like, I dread to think, not dread to think, but I do sometimes wonder if I hadn't made that decision and I just stuck with football, like where would I be? Like, rowing's a sport where you can be part of a massive community. Rowers always look out for rowers, no matter where you go and no matter what level you're at. Like, people love to meet other rowers.
Absolutely.
To meet other rowers.
And on my account, actually, one of the sort of top posts was, I was making a joke about how when you see rowing on TV, it's like, oh my God, it's there. It's like, that's my sport.
There's the meme of Leonardo DiCaprio from what was it, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, where he's got like a drink in his hand and a cigarette, and he's like whistling like, and he's like pointing at the screen. It's like, that's every row. Whenever you see rowing on the telly, like,
exactly.
When the Social Network came out, and everyone was just losing their minds because there was that one scene at Henley where Harvard were against the Netherlands. And everyone's there just like, oh yeah, no, I do that.
Yeah. And I think there's going to be a huge part of that when the boys in the boat come out, and there's already people saying, we're going to go down and watch it as a club and all this sort of stuff. And I'd like to think it'll be a big thing for the sport in terms of getting just the image of rowing out in the eyes of the public. And I really hope it sort of becomes a big film, just because I love the sport and I'd love other people to also love the sport.
I'm going to see it tomorrow. So
oh really?
There's a few of us in the team that have got a special viewing for it. So I'm very much looking forward to it. I agree with you. I think it's going to be cool. And again, it's that visibility. People will see an epic story of just regular guys at the
Hmm.
University of Washington who was obviously, you know, had a dream, trained bloody hard, and they went out and got after it.
Hmm.
Um, it is an awesome story. I've read the book as well, and it is. I would urge anyone to read the book. Um, yeah, it's so awesome.
And I was actually lucky enough this summer to be able to go over to Washington because my girlfriend's from over there.
Okay.
We did a little bit of a sort of pilgrimage down to the boathouse just to go and have a look at the sort of shed and
The
the
original one.
husky, yeah, and the sort of boat hanging up in the roof there. And
Yeah.
and then we went over to Squim where Joe's from, and I'll be honest, it was a little bit disappointing. It was just a town, but it was like this is where it all happened, and I think
Mm.
that's just quite a cool thing to sort of for those guys. I don't know if there's any more of them still around, but just the whole sort of history and story. I think it's so important that the whole part of the story was they were just a bunch of guys, and
Mm.
they were just students that were on the team because it meant that they could have a job
Mm.
at school, and I think that's such a cool thing. And it I think opportunities like that within rowing, and I think even for myself, like within rowing, it's opened so many doors to me. I would have never gone to Sierra Nevada. I'd never gone to San Diego. I'd never gone to sort of Varese in Italy,
Mm.
all within 2 years.
Yeah.
If it hadn't been for rowing.
I mean, I sort of look at the guys that I'm surrounded by, and I think very similar things. Like when I first turned up to Brooks, I lived with Rory Gibbs, who's
Hmm.
obviously now in the GB8 with me. And when he started at Brooks, he came from Millfield School, who had only just started rowing as an establishment. And I think he came with like a 6:45 2K.
Hmm.
So like when I think it's very easy to like look at the World Championships and look at the Olympics, and you see these, you look at it with rose tinted glasses, and you think
Hmm.
like, oh, these are my heroes. Like they must have just flown through their career and been epic at everything.
Hmm.
I look at Rory, and he was useless when he started at Brooks. Like he is one of those guys who is just one of the boys in the boat. Like he worked so hard to
Hmm.
get to where he is now, and it's all credit to him. And I feel really lucky to have seen him when he was totally rubbish. And and like with you, like I remember when you started, and I remember you, if you don't mind me saying, like you did struggle at the start,
Oh yeah.
but you slowly figured it out, and you got to a point where, I mean, God, you're an under 23 world champion. Like it's it doesn't just sort of happen for people. You've got to work pretty hard. But I think, yeah, you speak to these people, and you hear their stories, and they're just, they're normal people, but they
Hmm.
work really hard.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think I'm sort of seeing more rowing teams being set up at more schools, and especially with the new rules in the PE where they're now letting clubs row in. I think things like that are just so great for the sport because it was completely overwhelmed with Eton, St Paul's, and I
Yeah.
think obviously Teddy's won it this year, and they're sort of obviously it's still a private school, but it's not like that same level of like having a zoo in their back garden sort of thing. It's like it's
Yeah, I mean,
cool to see.
I'm biased because I coached at Teddy's for a few years, and
Hmm.
I was over the moon to see them win the PE. Like the job that Johnny Singfield and Adam Moffat have done to get that over the line, and not only just that, but like the women's team as well. You've got Natasha Townsend, who's
Hmm.
done an incredible job with bringing the girls up. But yeah, I think like the new rules in the PE are very exciting. I do think there needs to be some like foundation sort of rules set in place so that you don't end up having some kind of like mutiny of a school to like just
Yeah.
come together and do a club. But yeah, maybe there'll be some like teething to make the rules totally watertight. But
Hmm.
you know, like we both know from Brooks, competition will only make things sort of a bit faster. So
Exactly.
it's, it'll be exciting for sure. I think it'll be very exciting to see what happens.
Thanks for Harry, very, very much for coming on and having a chat. And it was great to hear. And any Coxes that sort of tuned in and listened to that, hopefully you've sort of taken a bit of his advice from earlier on. And yeah, good luck going forward with the rest of your season.
Yeah, thanks very much, Ben. Yeah, it's been a pleasure to come on.